So we're slowly getting to the end of the day. Probably a couple more talks before you can relax and start digesting what you heard here today. How's it going so far? Good? Fantastic. Okay, I'll try to keep the same spirit, the same level. Hopefully keep you engaged and interested. I'm Marcin Floryan. I'm currently a tech tribe lead at Spotify. Wow, someone from Spotify on stage. You might have heard this company mentioned a few times already today, at least if you've been in this room. I don't know about other rooms. Sorry, my Russian or Ukrainian is not quite as good. And I'm going to try and tell you a little story today from one little corner at Spotify, which is called the Playback Tribe, and where I am the tribe lead. But we'll get to the Playback Tribe in a while. So I guess this is really why I'm here, or at least this is really why there's all the buzz about Spotify. October 2012, Henrik, who I believe will be here tomorrow. I haven't had a chance to bump into him today. And Anders wrote this paper about how Spotify thought about scaling Agile back then. And actually, this is super interesting. Fred, earlier today, I don't know if he's around, mentioned something super interesting. He mentioned that there is an opportunity for your process and your environment to be misaligned. And this is sadly what I have seen many, many times when people took this paper, which wasn't really entirely true back then, and certainly has no bearing to how Spotify works today anymore, and try to copy that. Because you end up with a structure and a process that probably doesn't fit your environment. So, you know, if you thought of copying the Spotify model, and I'm actually glad some people already mentioned this, don't, right? Just don't. It's a bad idea, and I will show you why in a moment. So of course, you know, instead what you should do is figure out what works for you in your context. And maybe I will try to show you a little bit about the journey that Spotify takes to figure out what works for us in our context that is constantly changing. But just to kind of reinforce this idea in your head that taking that Spotify model is not maybe such a great idea, you know this names, tribes, and chapters? Do you know why we pick those names? Does anyone have any idea? No. The only reason we picked those names was because nobody in the industry at the time used them. Do you see that? So if you've used them, you've completely missed the point. Because we wanted to use names that had no association so that we can create something that would be our own. There we go. So this is what Anders says. He's one of the authors of this paper. And he says that this model works well for us and worked well for us then was because it's so well aligned with our culture, with our technical architecture, with our platform, our product, and even our physical workplace. So, if you have an office in Stockholm, and you write a music player, and you have a lot of engineers from KTH, which is the university in Stockholm, and you have nice squad rooms, then this model will probably work for you. But if not, I'm sorry to say, we have to look at something else. So what's the story today? I'm going to start with some key takeaways. So in about 40 seconds, you'll be ready to leave with the main ideas, and then you can choose to see the other session. But maybe you'll decide to stay. I will talk about the topic of this presentation, which is how we link principles and practices. So something which is a little bit more abstract, and something that is very, very concrete that happens day to day. And then I will show you how during a year in my tribe, we've actually evolved some practices based on principles that we also had to discover ourselves. And then there'll be some summary and maybe a few seconds for questions. I'm sorry I will have to leave straight after my talk, which means that if you have lots of burning questions, I would welcome them very much on Twitter or LinkedIn. It's pretty easy to find me. So if you find that burning thought that you want to satisfy, do not hesitate to reach out to me. If you connect with me on LinkedIn, please tell me why. I kind of like to know where people know me from. Okay, so here are some tweetable nuggets of wisdom. We all operate in complex adaptive systems, and so we need to pick our tools accordingly. The tools that work in our context, more about it later. Setting expectations and following up is crucial for success. Okay? So we can't just let people be in whatever way they want. They have to have some boundaries. I really have to disappoint you a little bit here and ask you to be realistic. You've heard about some stories today already. These things take a long time. And they always take much longer than we would like them to take. You know, any change that we're trying to do doesn't take weeks, doesn't take months, it takes years. And finally, actually going back to basics, something that you probably heard in the user stories talk earlier today or in Fred's talk. Before that, the basics, the fundamentals really matter. And that's where we should focus our attention. So think for a moment, in your own organization, what are the principles that you follow? How is your company set up? Why do you do certain things in a way that you do them? At Spotify, for example, we have those 5 values. You can find them displayed in some areas around the office. You can certainly read about them when you go up and down in the lifts, which we tend to do a lot because our lifts are not very fast. Does anyone here recognize any of these values as maybe something that you talk about in your own company, in your own context? Fantastic. I see some names, some hands going up. Exactly. So, you know, these are very generic. We all want to be collaborative. We all want to have fun. You know, we talk a lot about innovation. But having those values or even sharing those values with Spotify doesn't make you Spotify. Of course not. So let's see, you know, how do we connect some of those values with actually what happens. So taking it from values, I'm going to talk about some principles. And these are the 5 principles that I picked for today. They are transparency, collaboration, feedback loops, aligned autonomy, and psychological safety. And I will start with showing you literally a very, very small sample of practices that relate to those principles. There are way more practices that we do that we're not going to have time to talk about. But what I want to emphasize is how you make the connection. What you might also notice again is there's Fred's talk. You might have seen the XP values. So they're not verbatim the same, but I think some of those principles or values that you see on this slide link pretty well to the XP principles. I have a little job for you to do while you're looking and listening about those practices. Think about your own company, your own context. Would the practices that I mentioned work in your company? You know, maybe you already do things like that, or maybe they're currently completely unthinkable. Because that will allow you to figure out whether this is something that you could try, you could adapt, or maybe this is something that you really have to throw away, but allows you to reflect on why is that? What is the principle that your company believes in, even if they don't speak about it explicitly, that make you what you are today and would enable you to go in some direction? Okay? It's a deal? You can do that? Some people are nodding. Okay, great. So, let's start with transparency. This is this very simple notion that whatever we do in the organization should be available to everyone in the organization. So, your balance sheets, your financial results are available to all your employees, right? Your calls with the investors are available to your employees. Yeah, all the documents that every single director in your company write can be read by anyone, every single engineer. That's at least how we approach transparency at Spotify. And here is one practical tool that I've used myself to create and encourage that transparency. This practice is called the top 3 check-in. It's an email. I send that email every Monday morning. And I send that email to my leadership team, so people who report to me, and to the leadership team above me, so to the people I report to. So it goes in 2 directions. And it helps me primarily. You know, all these tools are really very selfish tools very often. It helps me to understand what I should focus on that week, but it also creates transparency for everyone else. So that people look at my top 3 and say, oh wow, you're going to look at whatever it was that week, I don't know, OKR planning, but you've forgotten about this hiring that is really urgent. And these things, and here's why I've also shown you a screenshot of my sent items in my inbox, but you see that actually people respond to these emails, not always, but sometimes, and say, wow, this is great, wow, this is horrible, you've forgotten about this big thing. Okay, so here's an idea, something that you could try in your organization or encourage your leaders to do, because that creates transparency. And it sparks a lot of conversations. That's how I know that I'm working on the right things to support my organization. So, transparency, pretty simple. As a principle, lots of practices. This is one. You can, I'm sure, think of 100 others. If transparency is important, use that. Collaboration is one of the cornerstones of Agile, right? Small collaborative teams that work together. So let's talk about a couple of practices that we use at Spotify in the Playback Tribe for collaboration. One we call Tribe Stand Up. We only call it that since 3 weeks ago. Before it was called the Delivery Stand-Up, and before that it was called the OKR Sync Meeting, and before that it was called 1 boring hour of looking at the spreadsheet and updating it. So that was pretty much 18 months of evolving this idea of how do we create collaboration and bring people together who work in the tribe. By the way, the size of this tribe is about 50 people. Okay? And the idea there that we have is that we would like to create focus for people who work together in a similar direction. We would like to create commitment. It's a little bit like Scrum of Scrums or the daily stand-up, only it happens once a week for the whole tribe. So you say, you know, my squad next week is going to deliver this. That kind of creates a nice commitment when you say out loud in front of all your peers. It creates belonging because people understand why we work together towards the same goal usually, or figure out, wow, wait, you're doing something completely contradictory to what this team is doing. And it allows learning because someone says, oh, that CDN rollout you've just mentioned, can you tell me more about this? So here's a little practice that helps us with collaboration, because then teams go, oh, I can help you with that. Or, you know, we said we're going to finish it this week, but we failed. Can someone help us with that? Here's another practice, a little bit bigger. You've probably seen this in the talk as well today. You know, any relation to any existing frameworks, purely accidental. We call it the big room planning. And we run it every quarter. And this is the idea that we currently have a quarterly planning cadence, and we use something I also mentioned OKRs. If you read any of the Google or Intel documents, papers, presentations about OKRs, the OKRs we do, nothing like that. Sorry, they're just the same name, but we also have objectives and we have key results, but we don't use all the other aspects maybe. But we use these OKRs, whatever the artifact is, to align the teams to say, okay, this is our plan for the next quarter. How does that plan look to everyone else, right? We don't have, which maybe used to happen in the past, we don't have one product director, my peer, come and say, thou shalt do these 7 big epics, divide it up and implement them. We kind of come with some ideas and some priorities, but the teams say, we think we're going to do this, we think we're going to do this, and we have this in our plan, we put it together, and then something comes out of it, which turns out usually a pretty nice and realistic plan for the quarter. What is super interesting in this particular practice, we've been doing it for over a year now, is that it turned out that it failed a couple of times when we tried it first. So we put together a plan, and a few weeks into the quarter, it turned out, nah, it's not going to happen. This key result is not going to be delivered, and that key result is going to be delayed, and we have a dependency that we didn't know about. So it turned out that, for example, we weren't good at capacity planning. We really didn't have a very clear view of every single team's capacity. People go on holidays, there is summer, there is hack days, and 100 other things. And so we have to be realistic, and we learned that something as simple as capacity planning was essential to make this practice work. So here's an example of how these practices build on some fundamentals. Okay, feedback loops. Another thing which I think we really owe this to the Agile manifesto and Agile movement in software, that this is something that has been talked about openly. I mean, it's not a new idea, right? Dates back to electronics, I believe, in the beginning of the 20th century maybe. But we've really made it something special, and that's great because it's super important, because that's one of the main mechanisms in which a system can control itself, by using the feedback. So here are some examples of how we think about feedback. Here's a practice that we called taps with squads. There's been lots of arguments at Spotify, where does the word taps come from? But actually, perfect example was just during the break. The musicians usually tap a little rhythm to make sure that you're all in sync, in the same tempo. And that was really the idea here, is that we try to create like this touch point, this tapping noise in the background, so that we connect the leaders of the organization, in this particular case in Playback, myself and Tobias, my product counterpart, with all the teams that work in our tribe. And we usually do it 1 or 2 times per quarter. And we have 4 topics. We talk about the impact that the team is having, what things do they deliver, and what's their health, both their technical health and team health. And we hear what help they need from us. What is super important is that they are just a little bit more structured checkpoints between the leadership team and the squads, but they are by far not the only way for us to interact. I mean, that would be a horrible failure. And so to give you another example of how we create those feedback loops so that we, for example, hear what's going on, is we have this practice of lunches with the leads, where we thought, we really wanted to hear what is going on. And, very often you go and walk in the corridor and talk to people when they work, but sometimes you kind of get a sense like, yeah, everything is fine, right? There's no problems. So we wanted to maybe create a little bit more relaxed opportunity, a bit longer. So we said, why don't we go out for lunch together? But rather than taking people, for lunch, the whole team or something like this, we created a little form where people can sign up and say, things like, yeah, I've got something to talk about, yeah, it's urgent or not, and I'd like to be alone, or I don't mind being there with a few colleagues. And then once we see some people sign up, we just go, okay, the 3 of you signed up, do you want to go out for lunch with us? It's been super interesting because that has really created a very close connection between the leadership team and the teams. And we actually stopped doing this now because we no longer need those lunches for engineers and other people in the tribe to come up to us and share their problems and worries and challenges. But having that practice of going out, having lunch together, and hearing directly what people have on their minds in a very open and transparent way, created the environment where it's now self-fulfilling, so to speak. Okay, something that has been very strongly associated with Spotify, autonomy. From the very early on, we said, we believe in autonomous teams. We call these autonomous teams squads. These autonomous teams have a lot of autonomy. They actually choose their own practices. They choose what tool to use to have their board. They choose the design of the board. They choose the process. They choose the libraries that they use to build their systems. They have a lot of autonomy, but it turns out that, of course, autonomy on its own is not very good because you end up with 50 teams each doing their own thing in their own direction. It's chaos, not execution. So it is super important to add alignment to that autonomy. And you've seen in the user stories talk about like how you can do user story maps, where you kind of try to have some common themes and threads. And that's a similar idea here. Like all these teams should have the freedom to choose how and what, but need to understand why, and that why need to be shared across the company. And it turns out that one of the practices that helps with creating that why is setting clear expectations. Turns out people need expectations, and that defining clear boundaries is an enabler for autonomy, not the other way around. And this is something that personally I, as a leader, have struggled with in the beginning, and I owe a lot to our Agile coaches who were brave enough to point it out to me and keep hammering it in my head, is that it's not enough to just let people go and say, build this amazing search experience or build this best playlist system if we don't actually understand who this playlist system is built for example. And also, this practice of setting clear expectations means that it allows people to take responsibility. Because now they understand that they have something that they are responsible for. These are just like those 4 little slides are some examples of the expectations that I have set with my teams. For example, I don't know, all code is readable, understandable, and maintainable. Right? Kind of feels pretty obvious, but it turned out that actually making it explicit, at saying it, this, as your technical leader, this is my expectation on every single engineer, made a big difference. There's a very nice quote from one of our Agile coaches in New York, Jason Yip, who says, autonomy isn't a benefit, it's an expectation of responsibility, right? So by giving people autonomy, we expect them to take responsibility. If you're interested in this topic, I really recommend the responsibility process from Chris Avery. Okay, so I promised you to tell you a little bit about the Playback Tribe. This is the Playback Tribe, or at least it was a year ago when we went to the beautiful beaches of the east coast of Sweden in Falkenberg, and got together to align and figure out what to do next, what is important for us, and to talk about our principles. But how do you talk about principles? Principles tend to be very abstract, very generic, and sometimes people find it hard to translate them into the work that they do. So we thought we would probably do well putting some structure in place. And this is the structure we put at the time. Maybe the structure works for you, maybe you find something else. The idea here, the metaphor, hopefully, as you can see, is that of a house. That we want to build a house that has a solid roof, which points to, like that was our entire tribe's vision and mission. I mean, the words on that slide really are not important. But we had this idea that we have something that binds us together, and then we have those 4 pillars. In our case, we chose the 4: product, delivery, people, and technology. And we decided that in those 4 pillars, we're going to do some work. That's where we're going to focus our work on our principles. And we decided to express our principles as aspirations. So rather than saying, there is some aspiration, some principle of transparency, we aspire to work with some things which relate to transparency. So we created those aspirations. There was an initial seed of ideas for those aspirations, but we did a World Cafe style conversations. Again, look it up, very nice practice if you haven't heard about World Cafe style workshops. And then people in the tribe, every single member of the tribe, from the POs, Agile coaches, engineers, sat together and looked through the ideas for those inspirations. Hopefully you will see 4 dimensions here. Those 4 time slots were those 4 dimensions. And then we chose to have 5 aspirations in each dimension. And then we discussed them, we argued whether TDD should be a technical aspiration or not, whether some other things in the people aspiration should be important or not. We ended up with some other formulations of these aspirations. That was the summary of that workshop. Again, hopefully 4 areas. And then what I want to draw your attention to in this particular picture is the dots. Can you see the dots? Lots of green dots. So we actually asked people to vote on which are the aspirations in each of those pillars that they care most about. We aspire to do something around how we, use metrics in our product. Was that important for people or not? You also maybe notice, if you're very, very kind of looking in detail, that there are some red dots in there as well. And we very deliberately gave people the opportunity to put a red dot to veto one of those aspirations, because we believe that really everyone in the tribe needs to be bought into those aspirations. And sometimes it is very important to feel that you can say no. Actually, learning to say no, very important practice. So out of this exercise came out a set of aspirations that we worked through over a year, picking one by one, maybe sometimes a couple. But it turned out that that in those aspirations, as they ended up being presented in those pretty slides and shared with the tribe, one aspiration stood out as one that people were particularly interested in. And that was the aspiration of creating an environment of psychological safety. How many of you have heard about psychological safety? Okay, quite a few hands go up, but maybe not all. So I'll try my best very quickly. The idea doesn't come from Google, but I think Google made it a little bit more famous when they did their study. The name of the study currently, Aristotle, thank you very much. Yes, that was the study. Where they looked at their teams and said, like, what correlates best with high performance in a Google team? And they have quite a few teams. And it turned out that the one thing that stood out, and you can actually check the results out on the website in their rework project, was psychological safety. So it was this idea that when you are in a team, you feel safe, and people usually focus on one dimension here, which is that you feel safe to admit mistakes. You feel safe to say, I don't know, ask for help, and you also feel safe to be who you are. So for example, in our tribe, we have 16 different nationalities. Among 50 people, 16 nationalities, people from Argentina, Ukraine, Poland, United Kingdom, you name it. Sweden, of course. And it turns out that, it was hard initially to bring your own culture into this mix and feel comfortable with the way you were brought up or the way you're used to. So it was important for people. So then we decided to work with this. Of course, what you have to start with is you have to start with education. So we did a bunch of workshops where we introduced people to what is this psychological safety, creating a common shared understanding of vocabulary, right? I hope you do that regardless of what kind of change you introduce. You start with allowing people to be on the same page. We all understand, we all have the same understanding of what Scrum is, for example, hopefully, when you decide to introduce Scrum into the organization. It's also pretty important to gather data. Understanding what is the current state, where are we today? So again, we used some examples that Google prepared in their research of surveys. We sent a survey with a bunch of questions. We changed some questions. Here's an example of the question that we changed. This was a question which was asked like this: is it difficult to ask members of the team for help? And then ignore the colors because they're not really good, bad in the way that you might expect, like as in red being bad. So it turned out that people disagreed with this statement, but as you can see, there are two graphs. One of those graphs is when I think about the person in the team that I'm most comfortable with. It turned out people were okay to ask for help from someone they felt comfortable with. But, no surprise, the person they felt least comfortable with, they weren't that comfortable asking for help. And of course, what that means, if there's someone with the expertise, but you don't get along with that person, you're not going to ask them for help that you need. And that's, of course, bad. So we understood that this needs to change, that we need to do some work. But rather than telling people this is how to change, we got the squads, we gave them the tools, and we said, okay, let's go work through this and figure out what are you as each particular team, including the leadership team, going to do differently in order to improve this situation? That we now understand what it is like because we actually have some data around it. So, some of those ideas were tiny. For example, one of my favorite small ideas from those workshops was one that the team said, it feels like we have quite a few introverts, but when we have a meeting, there are two extroverts who always speak up. Do you recognize that? Ah, exactly. So what that team decided was that every single time there will be an important question in a meeting that the whole team participates in, before anyone speaks up, everyone takes a post-it note and writes their idea down. Right? Takes extra 2 minutes, but allows everyone to form an opinion in their head. We no longer rely on the person who's the fastest to speak up or who's the quickest to think on their feet. But everyone has an opportunity to express their idea. And it turns out if you write your idea down on a piece of paper, it kind of sticks. And you then enables you to speak about that idea. The leadership team, for example, decided to clarify what kind of behaviors we expect from people in the tribe. And we did this poster. And of course, posters do not create psychological safety. Hopefully that's obvious. But it was a nice reminder for people of, the thing I mentioned earlier, setting expectations. We have an expectation that we listen without judgment, that we care for one another, and so on. And of course, as I say, this is just a reminder. This was like an opportunity for people to say, we're in a stand-up and we hear something, someone, I don't know, not assuming good intent, to get like, oh, but we agreed that we're going to assume good intent. Yeah, like that poster is like this little duck that you can point to and say like, oh, look, I see something that is not entirely in the way we agreed it to be. A little bit of a social contract, if you like. By the way, this picture is my Twitter profile. I tweeted it, so you can just copy it from there if you want. But the value in this poster was that we wrote this together. That we didn't take something off the shelf, but we really worked through, like it was painful to work through these sentences and write it down. But we did that together. Another thing that came out of the psychological safety workshops was this idea that we want to give and receive personal feedback. And we ran a series of workshops on giving and receiving feedback, but we introduced this practice of having a feedback jar in every team. Very simple visualization technique. You know, every single time someone received a piece of feedback, they would put a little ball inside this jar, and then the teams would share pictures of how full the jars are, and then they could see if this is really happening or not. Okay. But now we're getting to some of my favorite examples of those practices that teams created themselves based on the principle of psychological safety. So one team said, we're really good at like blameless post-mortem and at talking about what happened at a large scale, but we want to be better at admitting small mistakes and using the opportunities of those small mistakes to improve. So they added a column on their board, and that column just had, you know, the tiniest of mistakes that people remembered that happened, and then they talked about these every Friday maybe, and then they would pull these things off that board once they discussed them. You know, not to celebrate them, but as a reminder and as a practice for people to express, you know, talk about their mistakes. Turns out it helps. But another practice, and I'm not going to talk much about this. Again, there's reference here. You can check it online. So we did something called effectiveness reviews for a few people, which is, you know, you heard about 360 feedback, where you reach out to a bunch of people and they either send you emails or fill some forms out. So this is a similar idea, but rather than doing that asynchronously, you invite all these people into the same room and you ask them to give you feedback in front of others around appreciations and improvement areas. Oh, does that feel a little bit uncomfortable even hearing about this? Good, some people are nodding. I've actually done one of those for myself. It was extremely uncomfortable. It was uncomfortable because, you know, not just someone told me I should be better at X, but someone told me I should be better at X in front of many other people in the team. Now it's so much harder for me to ignore that piece of feedback, right? Because now everyone knows I kind of said, yeah, I want to be better at this. Good practice. If your organization is ready for it, I would really recommend it. And then finally, I think the most unexpected and wonderful practice that came out of psychological safety. This practice or this workshop that the team called What's Not to Like About This Code. So it turned out that in their discussions about psychological safety, they decided that the thing that was stopping them most was being able to talk about the code that they write, but in a way that didn't touch on the people who wrote the code. So the observation they had was, we do pull requests. Probably many of you also have that practice in your teams. You make a change, you do a pull request, and people write comments or review those pull requests. And people were really not comfortable writing honest and good reviews of your code because they were like, this code is shit, but if I say that, the person is going to be offended, and it's my friend. I don't want to do that. So they felt like this is really stopping them. So they wanted to find a way to improve there. And they decided to do it in this way, which was to have a facilitated session where they picked a piece of code that they wrote, and then they would identify problems in that piece of code. I'll give you a few more details around like how it actually works in practice. And then they wrote those problems in the code down, and then they followed up with mob programming sessions where they actually tried to fix those problems. But what was super important was that in those sessions where we talked about what's not to like about this code, they really focused on saying, I don't like this if statement because it's unclear for me what it's trying to test. You know, I don't like the number of arguments that this method takes. I don't like the fact that there are 4 return statements in this method. So, you know, very little judgment, just personal opinions, very little judgment about who wrote it and why they wrote it, just the idea about, you know, I look at this piece of code and this is what I don't like. And the facilitator had to, quite a few times, I've been part of some of those sessions, had to say, You just said you don't like what someone wrote here. And we're really talking about the code. Can you rephrase this sentence in a way that it talks about the code, not about the author of the code? It took some time getting used to, but it became such a powerful practice for that team. By the way, I want to actually credit JB Rainsberger, if you ever came across him, for showing us at Spotify this practice. And he actually wrote some of those facilitation guides for us. And this practice ended up actually improving our code base. So work on psychological safety resulted in better code. We had no idea that that would happen. Of course, what you do in any good Agile team, when you start off with something, then you try to close the feedback loop and review those aspirations. So maybe 3 weeks ago, we got away onto another offsite, this time in Poland, and we looked at our aspirations and we said, okay, each team rated those aspirations and said, are we living up to those? This is where it's green. Or are we not living up to those, the red bits? Or are we kind of there, but more work is required? So now we have fantastic input into, okay, maybe we should change some of those. Maybe we should throw away some of them because they're no longer relevant because we're already doing this. A next iteration, right? See the pattern? The same thing you do with your product, you do with your process, and you do with your organization. And just the last practice, the idea of job rotation. We call this embeds. So this was one of the aspirations that we had a year ago, that engineers would move between teams and spend some time in another team to increase the knowledge sharing, to get the feeling of belonging, because you suddenly also not only care about your team's code, but someone else's, be inspired, help people grow. This was an aspiration, and we actually had an explicit OKR around it a year ago. Nothing happened. For a year, nothing happened. That aspiration was misplaced. And it actually will happen in Q4 this year. So it took us a year of changing the environment, creating the right conditions, and now suddenly, without prompting, without an explicit OKR, people said, yeah, I want to move to that team. We have 3 people changing teams in Q4, which is actually a very good practice if you can try it. But it just gives you the idea of how long it sometimes takes for a practice to take hold. Okay, you've seen this picture earlier today already. It's a super important picture for anyone working in a complex adaptive system. But the reason I'm bringing this picture up here in the context of the practices is that I want to draw your attention to the idea that given that we have different domains, those different domains deserve different kinds of practice. And in the Cynefin model, they call the best practice, good practice, and emergent practice. I can leave this as a exercise to the reader to figure out which of the practices you've seen me demonstrate earlier today fall into which category. But what is important is that I believe I would like to encourage you to establish an allergic reaction to the term best practice. Because that only works in the obvious domain or the simple domain, where the cause and effect are clearly linked. And if that's not the case in your organization, then you should probably not be looking at best practice, at taking something off the shelf and putting it into your teams, at taking the Spotify model and putting it into your teams, taking SAFe and putting it into your teams, taking whatever else it is, less and any other practice without thinking about this. Maybe sometimes your team is in the place where those fundamentals are missing, and then maybe that's a good starting point. But really the area I would encourage you to focus on is the area of emergent practice, where you don't know upfront what it's going to be, like with this example of practice of what's not to like with your code. No one knew that's going to happen. It happened because we created the right environment. Okay? If you need some inspiration for your set of principles, there's plenty. The beyond budgeting is a particularly good one if you're thinking about enterprise-wide agility, not just in your tech departments. Maybe you look at Spotify and think there's something interesting here. Maybe one of the practices I told you about today is something you will want to try in your company. Modern Agile, I find, has a very good set of principles that can guide you toward good practices. The Lean Enterprise book, or the company-wide agility with beyond budgeting, open space, and sociocracy. Again, you've seen one example from sociocracy earlier today. These are all great sources, so use them. Okay, last slide, I promise. Remember, things take a long time. Be patient. Choose your own practices that are coherent with your set of principles or values. Every new practice is an experiment. Treat it as such. Evaluate, change, throw away, and never stop iterating. So, in essence, don't scale things up, break things down. That's how you scale Agile, by the way. I leave you with this thought. Things become better when we accept them as they are, not as we want them to be. There was a little Twitter storm when someone quoted this during my last talk around the word accept, because they said, does that mean that we have to accept things as they are, as in we will not change them? No, but it's super important to be realistic about where you are. You know, if we go back to Fred's talk, where are you on that scale left up? You know, are you really mature with your technical practices, or are you a novice? And start from where you are. Thank you very much.